Nineteenth-Century China, Part 1, 1800 to 1842. At the turn of the 19th century, China's fortunes seemed as bright as ever. It was the largest and most powerful country on earth. It had the largest economy, and it was home to some of the biggest cities on the planet. Merchants from all over the world came to China's shores, seeking her commodities: silk, tea, porcelain, and sugar. There was little the rest of the world produced that China needed, except for silver, which it accepted in great quantities for its produce. The ruling dynasty, the Qing, was of foreign stock, originally coming from Manchuria. Though they had ruled China for centuries, they regarded themselves as a separate caste. They administered the country jointly with the majority Han-speaking population. Under the Manchus, China had extended her borders, eliminating the age-old threat from the steppe. It had conquered and brought in Mongolia and Xinjiang, as well as Tibet, and its borders to the north with the only other power in the region, Russia, were stable. Yet under the surface, not everything was going well. China was facing a growing socio-economic problem. Its population had grown from 100 million in 1400s to 450 million by 1800. China was rapidly running out of arable land, losing the ability to feed its growing population and bearing the burden of increasingly destitute masses. At the upper level, there were problems as well. China had far more graduates with elite degrees than it had positions for them. By 1800, 1.4 million degree holders were competing for about 20,000 jobs, a 70-to-1 ratio. These scholars, cut off from the traditional route to advancement, formed the bitter, educated pool of malcontents. For those who did make their way into the bureaucracy, they found the system frustratingly corrupt. The positions offered little pay, but plenty of opportunity for graft. Bureaucrats earned a decent living by collecting fees from those beneath them. Often, the weight of this system fell most heavily on the impoverished peasant class. Some officials, like the notorious courtier He Shen, turned corruption into an art form, carving out princely fortunes for themselves. In these circumstances, rebellion became commonplace throughout the 19th century. Facing grinding poverty, peasants gave ear to groups like the White Lotus Society, a Buddhist millenarian sect who predicted the end of the world and called for violent revolution. Other groups, like the Eight Trigrams, tried to assassinate the emperor, going as far as to break into the Forbidden City. To add to China's woes, it began to face currency pressure as well. For centuries, silver had been China's main currency, and there had never been a lack of eager foreign merchants, anxious to supply her with it in exchange for Chinese coveted produce. Things began to change in the early 19th century. The balance of trade payments started to flow in the opposite direction. Silver revenues to the government began declining, leading to decaying infrastructure and falling salaries for officials who tried to make up for the shortfall with even more corruption. Behind this silver shortage were China's European trading partners. Europeans had been arriving and trading on China's shores since the 16th century. In the 1760s, the Chinese had been able to funnel all foreign trade into the city of Canton, modern-day Guangzhou, and what became known as the Canton system. Here, the government mandated that all trade between foreigners in China should be conducted by a small group of approximately 10 traders, called the Kohong. Foreigners, for their part, were limited to a small 400-yard long and 300-yard wide strip of land. From China's perspective, this system worked well. It kept the foreigners contained, and as long as they kept bringing silver by the ton, they were happy to keep doing business with them. This system was less than ideal from the Western perspective. China had commodities that were in great demand back home, but fearing a shortage of specie, Western nations wished to find something other than silver that the Chinese consumers demanded. By the late 18th century, the British had finally found a solution: opium. From their colonies in India, the British began growing the poppies used to make opium. They would then harvest and process the drug using cheap native labor. The product would be loaded into 150-pound chests and then onto British ships. As demand soared, the imperial government issued edicts in the early 19th century cracking down on the drug. Rather than halt the spread of the drug, this just drove it underground. Merchants developed smuggling networks with their Chinese counterparts. They would anchor off the coast and clandestinely sell their product to Chinese drug dealers in fast-moving ships. Western perceptions of China and itself were also transforming. Britain was beginning to undergo rapid change because of the nascent Industrial Revolution. It now found it had new sources of power, but also new problems. One of which was the overproduction of manufactured goods and the need to find new markets to sell them. With its population of nearly 500 million people, British manufacturers and merchants saw a huge potential market in China. The ideology of free trade was becoming almost gospel among the British mercantile classes. They became increasingly frustrated with Qing restrictions. Furthermore, many Europeans disapproved of Chinese legal practices, which tended to impose the death penalty, even in instances of accidental death. In a few cases, Europeans were executed in this way, fueling accusations of barbarism. On several occasions, the British attempted to enter into diplomatic talks with the Qing government. The most famous of these was in 1793, when Lord Macartney was sent by the British Crown to engage in direct talks with the Chinese. For their part, the Chinese conventionally regarded themselves as the peerless Middle Kingdom and recognized only tributary vassal states. China in the West had different diplomatic traditions, and this led to mistrust and misunderstanding during the Macartney mission. One of the major sticking points was whether Macartney should kowtow or not. This form of abasement was customary among vassal states, but would have implied Britain's submission to China. He ultimately compromised on the genuflect. Macartney requested that the Chinese grant Britain a permanent embassy in Beijing, that it open additional ports for trade, and set fair tariff rates. The Macartney came bearing gifts and specimens from British manufacturing. The Qilong Emperor remained unmoved. He sent Macartney away with a condescending letter and little else. Later diplomatic missions would be even less successful. For China itself, as the 19th century moved into its second and third decades, opium addictions continued to grow rapidly. Along with it came a rise in criminal gangs tied to the trade, like the Triad Society. From the court's perspective, opium carried another hidden cost. As demand for opium grew, China's favorable balance of payments began to go in the opposite direction. Rather than being the destination of the world's silver, China was hemorrhaging silver to pay for its opium habit. This, in turn, caused economic turmoil and prompted the emperor to seek scholarly advice. In 1830, the Daguang Emperor held a series of debates among his top counselors. Some favored legalizing the drug, growing it in China, and taxing it as a way to drive away foreign smugglers. Most, though, considered the drug to be harmful and immoral. They urged the emperor to root out the poison once and for all. This position ultimately won out, and by 1838, the emperor was firmly committed to doing everything to keep the substance out of China. To achieve this end, he sent one of his most capable and incorruptible officials to Canton, Lin Zexu, in March of 1838, and ordered him to stamp out the practice. Lin got to work immediately. Within 2 months, he had arrested 1,600 users and dealers and confiscated 35,000 pounds of opium. He next moved against the source of the drug, the foreign merchant community in Canton. He sent a letter to Queen Victoria remonstrating her for allowing her subjects to sell the drug in China. He then moved against the Western opium merchants, demanded that they hand over the drug, and he ordered all foreign trade stopped and went as far as detaining 350 members in Canton until his demands were met. After 6 weeks, they yielded, and over 3 million pounds of opium were seized and destroyed. He felt confident he had rooted out the problem. The opium traders had a powerful lobby in Britain and had been advocating for a harder line for years. While the British public was not in favor of the sale of opium per se, they were scandalized by the fact that Lin had detained British subjects and destroyed their property. Parliament authorized Admiral George Eliot to take action against the Qing. Hostilities began in June of 1840. With their superior naval firepower, the British were able to seize several coastal cities. The British and the Chinese could not come to terms, though, and the war went on. In the spring of 1842, the British hatched a plan to divide China in half by penetrating the Yangtze River, China's main commercial artery. One of the novelties of this war was the use of steam-powered ships, like the Nemesis. This allowed the British to go upstream, even in shallow water. Armed with exploding shells, they were able to siege Shanghai before moving upriver and capturing Nanjing, the former capital of the Ming Dynasty. By late August of 1842, the Chinese were asking for terms. Hostilities ceased with the signing of the Treaty of Nanking. The Qing agreed to pay $21 million as an indemnity, putting an even greater strain on the already tight imperial budget. They ceded Hong Kong to the British and agreed to open 5 additional port cities for foreign trade. The Qing also agreed to mutually negotiate tariffs on foreign imported goods with the British. This would hurt China later as it attempted to industrialize, since it would not be able to protect its industry from foreign competition. The British were also granted extraterritoriality, meaning that they would be tried according to British law, even in China. They later received the right to send missionaries to treaty ports. Other Western powers received similar concessions.